At 4:23 in the frozen darkness of January 18, 1945, Sergeant Ernst Bauer crouched in a burned-out barn on the eastern edge of Golub, East Prussia, watching Soviet reconnaissance troops emerge like ghosts from the morning fog less than 400 meters away. His hands, calloused from 30 years at the forge, gripped the release mechanism of a weapon his own officers had called insane. If you're fascinated by the most desperate and unconventional tactics of World War II's final months, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of soldiers forced to the absolute edge of human ingenuity. Ernst Bauer had never wanted to be a soldier. Born in 1906 in a small Bavarian village near Rosenheim, he had learned his father's trade at the forge, shaping horseshoes and farm tools, repairing wagon wheels, crafting the simple iron implements that sustained rural life. He married Anna in 1928, and they had 3 children before the world collapsed into war. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Bauer was 33, too old for the first waves of conscription, and deemed more valuable maintaining agricultural equipment for the Reich's food production. He watched younger men march away in columns, their faces bright with propaganda and confidence. He watched many of them never come back. For 5 years, Bauer remained at his forge, hammering metal while the war consumed Europe. He listened to the radio reports of victories in France, in Russia, and North Africa. He saw those victories turn to stalemates, then retreats, then desperate defenses. The boys who left his village in 1939 were replaced by boys who looked even younger in 1943, and then by boys who were barely 16 in 1944. The regime was bleeding out, consuming its future to sustain its present, and Bauer knew what that meant for men like him. The summons came in October 1944, not to the regular Wehrmacht, but to the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, Hitler's last desperate gamble to throw every available body into the defense of the crumbling Reich. At 38, Bauer was handed a uniform that didn't fit, an armband bearing a red band and a swastika, and a World War I-era Gewehr 98 rifle with exactly 30 rounds of ammunition. His training lasted 5 days. Most of it consisted of propaganda films and speeches about duty, sacrifice, and the miracle weapons that would turn the tide. The instructors, exhausted veterans pulled from the Eastern Front, looked at the assembled men with something between pity and contempt. They were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, postmen. They were fathers and grandfathers. They were not soldiers. Bauer was assigned to Volkssturm Unit 14208, designated for the defense of East Prussia. In late December, his unit was deployed to the town of Golub, a small settlement astride a crucial road junction that connected several evacuation routes for German civilians fleeing the Soviet advance. The strategic situation was beyond desperate. The Red Army's Vistula-Oder offensive was grinding through German defenses like a thresher through wheat. Entire army groups were disintegrating. Refugees clogged every road. Tens of thousands of people trudging westward through snow and ice, fleeing the vengeance they knew was coming. Golub itself was barely a military position. There were 47 men in Bauer's unit, ranging in age from 16 to 62. Their equipment was a museum of obsolescence. Rifles from the First World War, a single MG-08 machine gun with a cracked water jacket, 3 Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, and assorted pistols and shotguns brought from home. They had no radio, no vehicles, no artillery support. Their orders were simple and impossible. Hold the crossroads, delay any Soviet advance, allow the civilian columns to pass through. Everyone understood what delay meant. It was a euphemism for die slowly enough to matter. The commanding officer was Hauptmann Dieter Wolf, a former schoolteacher from Dresden who had lost his left arm at Stalingrad and been sent home to recover. When the Volkssturm formed, they dragged him back into service. He was 46 years old, haunted by nightmares, and carrying the weight of knowing he was leading men with no training into a battle they couldn't win. On their second night in Golub, Wolf gathered the unit in the basement of the town's small church. The temperature outside was 15 degrees below zero. Inside, their breath formed clouds in the candlelight. "The Soviets will come through here," Wolf said quietly, pointing to a hand-drawn map. His voice carried no martial enthusiasm, only exhausted pragmatism. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. We have positions in 3 buildings overlooking the crossroads. We fire, we slow them down, we fall back to the church, we hold as long as we can. Questions? A boy named Klaus, barely 17, raised his hand. His voice cracked when he spoke. Sir, how long do we need to hold? Wolf looked at him for a long moment. Long enough. Nobody asked what that meant. They all knew. Bauer said nothing during the briefing, but his mind was working through a problem that had been forming since they'd arrived. He had inspected their defensive positions, counted their ammunition, assessed their weapons. The mathematics were simple and fatal. If a Soviet infantry platoon attacked with any coordination, the Volkssturm unit would be overrun in minutes. The MG-08 might kill a dozen men before it jammed or ran out of ammunition. The rifles were accurate but slow. 47 untrained men against professional soldiers hardened by years of brutal combat was not a fight. It was an execution. That night, while others tried to sleep, Bauer walked through Golub's abandoned workshops and homes. Most residents had already fled westward. What remained was the detritus of interrupted lives. Tools left on workbenches, meals half-eaten on tables, children's toys scattered in frozen yards. In a metalworking shop near the edge of town, he found what he was looking for. A lathe, welding equipment, metal stock, heavy springs from an old truck suspension, steel cable and lumber from collapsed buildings. For 3 days, Bauer worked in that shop, sleeping only in brief intervals. The other men thought he was scavenging or hiding. Wolf found him on the 2nd day, surrounded by metal shavings and half-assembled machinery. "What are you doing, Sergeant?" Wolf asked, not unkindly. Bauer looked up from the welding torch, his face streaked with soot. "Buying us time, sir." He explained his idea. Wolf listened, and his expression moved through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been desperate hope. "That's insane," Wolf finally said. "Yes, sir. It might not work." "Probably won't, sir." Wolf looked at the half-assembled contraption, then back at Bauer. "How long do you need?" "1 more day." "You have it." When Bauer finally wheeled his creation to the barn overlooking the eastern approach to the crossroads, the other men gathered to stare. Someone laughed. Someone else made a joke about medieval sieges. The device was crude, massive, and looked like something from a historical reenactment gone wrong. It was a ballista, or rather a modern approximation of one. Built on a reinforced wooden frame with truck springs providing torsion power, it was designed to launch steel projectiles, sharpened rods, roughly 18 inches long, that Bauer had machined from pipe stock and bar iron. The triggering mechanism was simple, the aiming crude, but the physics were undeniable. The potential energy stored in those heavy springs, released suddenly, could accelerate a steel projectile to lethal velocity. "You cannot be serious," said a man named Otto, a former postal worker. "We're supposed to fight Russians with that?" Bauer was adjusting the elevation, testing the release mechanism. "If they come in a column, in the fog, close together like they usually do on reconnaissance, yes. That's archaic, that's stupid. That doesn't need ammunition we don't have," Bauer interrupted quietly. "I can make more projectiles from any metal we find. I can reload this in under a minute. And if it works once, it'll make them hesitate, make them deploy wider, waste their time. That's what we're here for. To waste their time." The laughter stopped. Everyone understood. They weren't here to win. They were here to die slowly. Bauer positioned the ballista in the barn's large doorway, partially concealed by hanging canvas and debris. He had a clear field of fire down the main eastern road, roughly 400 meters of visibility before the tree line, and morning fog obscured the approach. He machined 24 projectiles and stacked them beside the weapon. He also kept his rifle, 30 rounds, and 2 grenades. If the ballista failed, he'd fight with everything else. If everything failed, he'd fight with his hands. But he wouldn't run. The civilians were still passing through Golub, families with children, old people struggling through snow. Every hour mattered. The Soviet reconnaissance patrol arrived on the morning of January 18th, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Bauer had been awake for 36 hours, rotating between the observation post and fitful rest periods. He was exhausted, cold to the bone, and terrified, though he showed none of it. At 4:23 a.m. in the pre-dawn darkness, he saw movement in the fog. Shapes, men, moving in a loose column formation, their white winter camouflage blending with the snow. He counted quickly, 20 to 25 soldiers advancing cautiously but not expecting serious resistance. Why would they? German forces were collapsing everywhere. These men were the tip of the spear, testing defenses, probing for weaknesses. Bauer's hands moved automatically, loading the first projectile into the ballista's cradle, cranking the springs back to full tension. The mechanism creaked softly. His heart hammered against his ribs. He thought about Anna, about his children evacuated somewhere to the west. He thought about the refugees still streaming through the crossroads below. He thought about the men depending on him, boys and old men who deserved better than this frozen hell. The Soviet patrol moved closer. 300 meters, 250. They were bunched together, moving through the narrow road cut between snowdrifts. Perfect, terrible, necessary. At 200 meters, Bauer aimed the ballista at the center of the column and released the trigger. The sound was unlike anything he'd expected. Not an explosion, but a deep thrumming snap, like a massive whip crack followed by a rush of displaced air. The steel projectile, weighing nearly 2 kilograms, launched from the frame at tremendous velocity. For a fraction of a second, it was visible in the dim light, a dark streak against the fog. Then it struck. The projectile hit the lead Soviet soldier in the chest, punching through his body and into the man behind him, and possibly a third. Bauer couldn't tell in the chaos. What he could see was the immediate, total disruption of the patrol's formation. Men scattered, diving into snowdrifts, shouting in Russian. They had no idea what had just happened. The sound was wrong for artillery, wrong for a machine gun, wrong for anything they recognized. Bauer was already reloading. His hands shook, but his movements were practiced. He'd spent 3 days training this one motion. Load, crank, aim, fire. 55 seconds. He fired again, adjusting for the soldiers spreading to the south side of the road. Another thrumming crack. Another scream in the darkness. The ballista's projectiles were silent in flight, invisible in the fog. The Soviet soldiers were fighting an enemy they couldn't identify, couldn't locate, couldn't understand. Panic is a weapon. Confusion is a force multiplier. Bauer understood this instinctively. He fired a third projectile, then a fourth, spacing his shots, making the enemy think there were multiple firing positions. The Soviet patrol, already nervous about advancing into potentially fortified positions, broke entirely. They withdrew, dragging wounded, leaving 2 dead in the snow. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. Wolf arrived at the barn as dawn broke, his face pale. What happened? They probed, they left, Bauer said. He was reloading projectiles, his hands mechanical. I heard something. Not gunfire. No, sir. Wolf stared at the ballista, at the spent projectiles, at the blood visible on the snow 200 meters away. Good God. But both men knew the truth. The Soviets would return. They would return with more men, with armor, with artillery. One repulsed patrol meant nothing in the grand calculus of the war. It meant everything to the refugees who had another few hours to escape. The next attack came 36 hours later. This time it was a full platoon, approximately 40 men, with a T-34 tank in support. They advanced more cautiously, spread out, using cover. Bauer's ballista was useless against dispersed infantry and irrelevant against armor. The battle became conventional: rifle fire, machine gun bursts, grenades. The Volkssturm unit held for 17 minutes before falling back to secondary positions. 3 men were killed, including Klaus, the 17-year-old boy. Bauer never learned his last name. They held the church for another day. The ballista was useless there, so Bauer dismantled it, salvaged the steel projectiles, and fought with his rifle. He killed 3 Soviet soldiers he could confirm, probably more he couldn't. He felt nothing about it. Not pride, not guilt, just the mechanical necessity of survival. When the ammunition ran out, they used captured weapons. When those ran out, they used grenades. When those ran out, some fought with entrenching tools and bayonets. On January 21st, Hauptmann Wolf ordered the remaining men to withdraw. There were 19 of them left. The civilian evacuation convoys had passed through. Their job, insane as it had been, was complete. They slipped out of Golub through a drainage culvert, moving west through snowfields while Soviet forces swept through the town they'd defended. Ernst Bauer survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in Bavaria in April 1945, emaciated, suffering from frostbite, and carrying wounds from shrapnel that would never fully heal. He spent 8 months in a POW camp, processing through the chaos of post-war Germany, and finally returned to his village in early 1946. Anna was there, having survived the evacuation with their children. His forge was gone, destroyed in an Allied bombing raid. The Germany he returned to was unrecognizable, broken, occupied, haunted. He never spoke about Golub. When veterans gathered, when men shared war stories over beer and cigarettes, Bauer remained silent. His children asked once, when they were older, what he had done in the war. He told them he had defended a crossroads. Nothing more. In 1963, a Soviet military historian researching German defensive actions in East Prussia found a peculiar report in captured Wehrmacht documents. It described a Volkssturm unit that had used primitive artillery of unknown type to repel a reconnaissance patrol near Golub. The historian dismissed it as exaggeration or mistranslation. The incident appeared in no official histories. Anna Bauer found her husband in his rebuilt workshop in 1971, slumped over his workbench, dead from a heart attack at 65. Among his tools, she found a rusted steel rod, about 18 inches long, sharpened at one end. She had no idea what it was. She threw it away with other scrap metal. Ernst Bauer received no medals, no recognition, no mention in any historical record of the war. His name appears on no memorials. The men he fought beside, those who survived, scattered across post-war Germany, and never spoke of what they'd done. The civilians who evacuated through Golub never knew that their survival had been purchased with the desperate ingenuity of a middle-aged blacksmith who'd built a medieval weapon to fight a modern war. The story is almost certainly unknown to history, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too small, too strange, too emblematic of the chaotic desperation that characterized the Third Reich's final months. Official histories record army movements, divisional actions, major battles. They don't record what happens when 47 untrained men are told to hold a crossroads with museum pieces and improvised weapons. They don't record the blacksmith who remembered that physics works the same way it did 1,000 years ago, and that a sharp piece of steel moving fast enough will kill regardless of the century. What Bauer did at Golub was not heroic in any traditional sense. He fought for a regime that had brought unimaginable evil into the world. He killed men who were fighting to destroy that regime. The moral calculus is impossible and irrelevant. What he was fighting for, in those frozen January days, was not ideology or politics or national survival. He was fighting for the families trudging through snow, for the old people and children who had done nothing to deserve the vengeance marching toward them. He was fighting because he'd been placed in an impossible position and chose to act rather than surrender to inevitability. The ballista he built represented something profound about the final stage of the Second World War. Germany's industrial might had been shattered by years of Allied bombing. Its armies were collapsing, its weapons production failing, its resources exhausted. The regime had devoured its own future, throwing children and old men into battles that were already lost. In that context, a blacksmith building a medieval weapon to fight Soviet infantry wasn't absurd. It was perfectly logical. It was the inevitable endpoint of total war, when everything modern has failed and men are forced back to first principles: force, leverage, mass, velocity. The weapon was crude, it was laughable, until it worked. War is supposed to be about technology, training, logistics, combined arms doctrine. But sometimes it's about one man who knows how to bend metal, who understand springs and tension and trajectories, who can look at scrap and see a weapon. Sometimes it's about buying 4 minutes, 17 minutes, one more day. Sometimes the difference between hundreds of civilians dying on a frozen road and hundreds of civilians making it to safety is one stubborn blacksmith who refused to accept that obsolete meant useless. The Second World War killed approximately 70 to 85 million people. Ernst Bauer was one man among millions who fought, suffered, and died or survived to carry memories they could never fully articulate. History remembers the generals, the battles, the grand strategic movements. It forgets the sergeant in the frozen barn, the improvised weapon that should never have worked, the few hours bought at terrible cost. But those hours mattered. To the people who lived because of them, they mattered absolutely. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten soldiers of World War II. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if someone in your family served in any war. These stories, these individual acts of desperation and courage and human complexity, deserve to be remembered. They remind us that behind every statistic was a person, behind every casualty report was a life, and behind every impossible situation were people trying to do what they believed was right, or necessary, or simply survivable. Their stories are not simple. They should never be forgotten.